Okay, so how has the rank and file strategy fared in DSA since its adoption in 2019? What are its drawbacks, either in theory or practice? What are the concrete political goals of DSA's rank and file strategy? Is creating a mass base of militant and democratic trade unionists a prerequisite for building socialist consciousness? What are the obstacles to making the RFS political? Um, and feel free to really just kind of take this topic question in any direction. I know we all have different, specific interests and um, specialties here. So really take this as kind of a broad prompt. Um, Henry, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So this is, I mean, I just want to start by saying, like, I think the most important perspective that we begin with when talking about the labor movement and just beginning this conference is the mass radicalization of youth and working people across this country and across the world that's taken place over the last 10 years and has continued to, in my opinion, escalate. I mean, if you look at the polling of people who are favorable to socialism, it's tremendously high. If you go out on the street and, I was at a party 2 weeks ago, it wasn't a socialist friends party, and yet it was just, normies, as they are called. And we were talking about landlords, we were talking about, there was people there who are organizing a union. So there's something in the water. So in terms of this subject, I think the rank and file strategy represents really a tremendous step forward, but also a theoretical danger. And I just want to outline what those two trends are, the positive and the negative trend, and really be specific and differentiate between the rank and file strategy that's outlined in Moody and what the classic Bolshevik rank and file strategy is, because they're really two different things. And I don't think that, so starting with the positive, so if you don't know, obviously Moody wrote this document, the rank and file strategy, and that's, I don't think that everybody who's reading through it or skimming through it is accepting all the finer theoretical points that Moody makes. I think mostly what people are getting out of it is the positive side, that socialists, largely middle-class, intellectual, socialist, activist types, that the worker movement, the working class is incredibly important, has the revolutionary potential in society, and that being among the workers, taking jobs in strategic industries, organizing in unions is one of the best ways to participate, and maybe even is better than being a staffer. And that um, there is a conservative union bureaucracy, and that there is sort of a rank and file resistance to this that provides a really serious basis for spreading revolutionary politics in the unions. And so I think those are three different understandings of rank and file that are in Moody's document. Number one, the importance of the working class as a whole. Number two, positionality. What should individuals do? They should take rank and file jobs. And then number three, rank and file caucuses as a key source of fight back, and the bureaucrat rank and file divide as a key opportunity, right? But if you take Moody's document and you take what is to be done, it's very, very clear that Moodyism, what I call Moodyism, is a direct rejection of what is to be done. I mean, it's more or less a line for line refutation or attempted refutation in a very lazy and sort of silly manner when you really get into it, of what makes Bolshevik trade union ism unique And that is the role of consciousness. And so I don't think that most people are reading Moody and they're saying, oh yeah, Lenin was wrong about consciousness. And, actually consciousness does develop spontaneously. And therefore, everything that Moody says is right. So I think when most people say the rank and file strategy, they're really talking about the first things, and most people don't even know that, Moody has this ulterior, which really a specific theory that developed at a specific time in the post-Trotskyist movement and shouldn't just be passed off. And one thing that annoys me is, it's just passed off as regular Marxism when it's at least be honest that you have a so-called, innovation that suddenly consciousness can be spontaneous. And so the biggest, I want to, sure, we can talk about this. I want to wrap up my initial contribution, but I think the biggest issue that this gets into, first of all, it's just a repetition of economism, and I have this document that you can read that goes through this line by line, but in what is to be done is all about refuting economism. If you're going to argue against what is to be done, that's pretty much you might as well just embrace economism openly. And so the big tactical or strategic discrepancy is the question of raising socialist politics directly with workers. So Moody has this whole idea that basically, and this came from the 60s, from SDS when he was organizing, that they had a lot of trouble like going to workers and talking about socialism. And so they figured, okay, let's just talk about workplace issues. The problem is, that's great. I go out to the airport lot, talk with Uber drivers, and I don't talk with them about socialism every time. But there are workers all over this country who are, again, what I began with talking about, this mass radicalization. There's millions of people, of working class people, who voted for Bernie Sanders. And to not talk with them about socialism is crazy. Is a huge missed opportunity. And the idea that everybody needs this sort of, it's really a stages theory of working class consciousness, needs non-socialist, militant trade union ideas to spread Moody's very jumbled idea of trade union and socialist consciousness, I think is a huge missed opportunity. Most people have not been radicalized by these so-called transitionary organizations. They've been radicalized by Bernie Sanders openly talking about socialism, even though we know he's not, a true socialist. Still, they've been they've been radicalized through open, direct socialism. And there's so the point is strategically that, yeah, we do want to engage people on the issues that they care about and use that as an opportunity to bring them towards socialism if they're not already ready. But there's millions and millions of people in this country who are ready. If you just go out on the street and say, are you a socialist? You can recruit them directly. And that if you don't do that, if you use this very indirect way, then you're wasting a ton of time. And you're, ultimately Moody never really lays out when do you actually make the break to socialism. That's something that if you talk with people who followed the strategy, for example, the leaders of the Mass Teachers Association, EDU, where you talk with, other socialists who spent decades in the trade unions, a lot of them will say, I've heard them say to me that, oh yeah, we never had time to actually talk about socialism. We never, were able to, we were always so focused on running the union side of things, building the Reform Caucus, the rank and file caucus, that we never really had the time to raise socialism. So we need an open socialist core of the labor movement, and we can unite hundreds of thousands, millions of workers to a frank, open socialist position. Around that, yeah, absolutely, we can build broader, fightbacks on bread and butter issues, on issues that an even larger mass is aware of. And when we study the history of the tool, the history of the Teamsters in Minneapolis, we find that, oh, fancy. how did you do that? We find that the history is totally different, and in fact, directly the opposite, or the theoretical considerations are directly the opposite of what Moody lays out. So a lot of comrades, they're reading Moody, they're getting good ideas about the importance of the rank and file.
Sorry, everyone, that technical blip was my problem. I figured out why they couldn't see their video. Henry, are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, I got booted for a second. Good morning. Oh yeah, so just my last sentence. A lot of comrades, they're seeing the importance of the rank and file. Some are being led astray into this anti-Bolshevik, anti-Leninist theory of spontaneous consciousness. And I think we want to uplift the first, and we want to educate about the second, and educate people about the importance of the socialist movement and the militant minority, and have them read the tool and that kind of thing. So those are.
Okay, thank you so much, Henry, and sorry about the technical difficulties there. I finally figured it out. Annie, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I wanted to kind of focus on aspects of the rank and file strategy that don't often sort of center themselves in these discussions, that often get kind of like overlooked in folks' reading of Moody. Specifically this question that Henry brought up at one point of transitional organization, which if you look through the essay is very key to a lot of what Moody is talking about, but at the same time doesn't really get brought up that much. So transitional organization, kind of like loosely deriving from Trotsky's theory of like a transitional program, is essentially this idea that Moody puts forward that consciousness develops in these sort of like layers and stages, and that socialists can't really operate when there's this lack of baseline militancy. He describes it as kind of like having like a sea to swim in. So essentially what he puts forward is that we need forms of organization that are broader than kind of socialist collectives, that will then raise the kind of baseline militancy of the working class, that socialists can then kind of swim through and begin to agitate for our politics. The most common like example of this kind of organization is the Reform Caucus, right? Like think of Teamsters for a Democratic Union, where you enter an existing union as a rank and file worker. You are pushing for better working conditions and economic demands, but in the process, you're sort of running against the union bureaucracy as a barrier, forcing you to organize your coworkers into a formation to transform the union into the kind of thing that can actually get those economic demands and better working conditions. This isn't actually the only thing that Moody like suggests as a possible transitional organization. It's the only thing that really is thought of as such when people interpret the essay and talk about it. But he also references things like identity-based caucuses, like Black caucuses and women's caucuses, and worker centers that sort of more loosely organize non-union workers, particularly like migrants who don't have like a right to unionize, or at least whose right to unionize is frequently suppressed. And also there's Labor Notes, which again was sort of founded as one of these transitional organizations, where the idea is that it would create sort of like a mass basis for socialist politics through labor militancy. There's always kind of a presumption in these discussions that what is pragmatic is whatever is most kind of like broad and immediate. So in any kind of organizing situation, you should prioritize this kind of like direct militancy based on personal experience over other political considerations. Moody actually kind of pushes back at times against like an over fetishization of reform caucuses. Me and Paul actually interviewed him for Cosmonaut and asked him about this, and he was like very firm that it's kind of a mistake that radicals often sort of think of the Reform Caucus as just the thing you go in and do automatically. And you can point to lots of examples of cases where socialists successfully took over unions, but didn't really transform the nature of the union. And so you end up just becoming like a rank and file leader who operates like a bureaucrat and does the same things that the bureaucrats were doing. So he is very opposed to this kind of like immediate takeover strategy. But at the same time, I think very much defends this sort of theory of class consciousness that I want to hone in on, where it comes in these stages where your level of militancy is sort of like raising over your experiences on the shop floor. You challenge your supervisor for the first time, you go out on strike for the first time, you have these sort of educational experiences that transform you as a person. And then that eventually opens up the route to socialist politics, but it comes in the form of like a series of tasks that come one after the other, right? Like first militancy, then politicization. It's worth, I think, taking this out of sort of like very abstract generalized context that we usually discuss this in, and considering like how this has actually worked out in practice. So of the transitional organizations that were founded in the 1970s, there are two kind of most notable ones that still exist. There's Teamsters for a Democratic Union and Labor Notes, which have been really, really successful at building up mass bases of labor militants, but they've also kind of internalized a politics of strict labor militancy, and like Labor Notes famously like often like pushes against even talking about socialism at their conference. So in practice, the actual like, political goals that these organizations were founded with haven't been met, even if the sort of narrower goals that they like put on their website have been to a limited degree. So I think that that opens up the question for us as socialists of how do we make an intervention in these kinds of organizations? I think that regardless of whether one agrees with the transitional view of consciousness, I don't. I think consciousness is better seen as this kind of complex dynamic process that often comes in these kind of like jumps and starts, right? Like think of 2020, like people you know who were never particularly political were suddenly like, we need to overthrow the government right now. And then demobilized like a few months later and we're like, actually, we need to elect Joe Biden. But regardless of whether one agrees with that theory of consciousness, I think the question, and Henry kind of raised this for us as socialists now, is, okay, we have a seat to swim in. What kind of political interventions should we be making? And I think that the answer is essentially to generalize the kind of militancy that we're seeing in the workplace and attempt to sort of broaden it into confrontation with the state and these broader political questions. Examples that come to mind in the Seattle carpenters strike the other year, there's a huge controversy between these rank and file carpenters and the construction companies that they're contracting with over parking, because parking in Seattle is extremely expensive and parking for jobs was taking a huge chunk out of their paychecks. So they wanted contract language about companies paying for parking. Shama Sawant, our Trotskyist politician friend in Seattle, who was doing very, very intensive kind of relationship building with the carpenters, was challenging their union bureaucracy, was going to all of their rallies, offered to sponsor legislation that the city would pay for their parking in order to kind of like circumvent the bureaucracy's failure to organize around it. And in that sense, kind of like took their demands and made them political in a broader sense by directly challenging the state. Another example is in 2020 in Minneapolis. The National Guard during the protests there used I think it was either a union hall or an AFL-CIO office, as kind of like a staging ground, and like set up shop there. And a group of rank and file workers essentially organized and kicked them out. So again, a direct confrontation with the state around political demands that were sort of transformative to the consciousness of the workers at the time, right? Like they're involved in this broader contestation, and rather than pure kind of like shop floor militancy, they moved into the realm of fighting against the state. There are a lot of other examples of this that I point out, that I could point out, and I don't want to waste everyone's time with 1,000 anecdotes about them, but essentially what I think we need to start thinking about is how do we broaden these struggles that are happening on the shop floor? How do we sort of transform consciousness beyond this question of like militancy or lack of militancy? What kinds of organization are going to be useful for us when we do this? Like, do we want to keep forming reform caucuses and stuff like labor notes, or do we want to kind of like experiment with new organizational forms that can push new kinds of politics? So these are all just questions that I wanted to raise for folks. I think we don't collectively really have the answers, and I think we've got into the habit of just kind of doing what we've seen other people do, like, okay, I'm going to get a job in this union and I'm going to start a reform caucus and I'm going to kick out the old leadership and I'm going to be the new leadership. And I think that we're entering an era where with stuff like the Amazon campaign, the Starbucks campaign, what's happening with the railroad workers right now, we're definitely confronting the state. It's time for us to start thinking about new methods and forms of organization.
Thank you so much, Annie. And last but not least, Paul.
Hey everyone, thanks a lot. I mean, first of all, I'll try not to go that long. This is y'all's convention and not mine, right? So y'all should do, the more talking you do, the better. And second of all, thanks Annie for the shout out on the St. Paul Labor Hall. I put a link of an article in there on that event, which I was part of, and I'll have I want to after this I'll bombard the chat with some links to some of the history that I'm talking about here. I think y'all did a great job kind of laying out the problems with the rank and file strategy. I think I just want to kind of give some context on like why were people thinking of these ideas and what were people doing with them, right? So I mean, first of all, right, like when guys like Kim Moody and the people who were in the IS were getting radicalized in the early 60s, they were in the early to mid 60s and late 60s, right? It was the age of civil rights movements, so like mass demonstrations, big anti-racist actions, anti-imperialist movement, like against the war in Vietnam. People were not super down with like electing politicians, right? It was like, I guess people went clean for Gene McCarthy, but then kind of, that wasn't as much of a focus, and then kind of changed later. But it was also the era of the huge rank and file revolts that we think about, like, Drum, Lordstown, things like Teamsters in the 70s, right? The Wildcat Postal Strike, like, stuff was going kind of crazy, right? So that I think is, what people were going off of, right, at the time. So they're like, cool, like, let's do that, right? Like, you can imagine being a worker, a student back in 1970 and seeing like the giant postal wildcat strike in New York City in 1970, and you're like, I'm gonna drop out of college, right? Like, you can understand where that was coming from. Late 70s, when Labor Notes was starting, was really kind of an era. People don't think of it as much as the late 90s, but really 78, 79, a lot of the socialist organizations in the various tendencies in the US were really in a lot of trouble. It was kind of a little bit of collapse and then regroupment in the early 80s. That I think informs a lot of what when Labor Notes at the beginning was like, and through the 80s was like, not allowed to talk about socialism during Labor Notes. You have to talk about it in the hotel room parties afterwards. That was the actual rule, right? Like, okay, well, why would a socialist be saying that, right? It's because the late 70s was really, the recession really just kind of was hard on them, right? So I guess and then in the 90s when he wrote Rank and File Strategy, the reason why he focuses so much on, getting a job or whatever is that was the era of Sweeney, and the for those who don't know, like the AFL-CIO at the time was, there is this kind of notion of reform for above, and he was really arguing against that and the idea of permeation, right? Like that was when staff jobs were like finally being open to radicals, basically. Yeah, he was a DSA member. He joined through, I think, a direct mail drive, 90s. So, right, so there's that going on. And then 2000s was really what Joe Burns laid it out really great in his book this year, but the era of the labor liberal, when I was kind of entering the labor movement in 2016, 2018, getting out of college, joining DSA, that was really high, high time for that, right? Like it was like, like unions are awesome. Like we love CWA, we love Unite here, right? Like, like union staffers rule, like SAIU is the best. So like, and and then it was also the era of Bernie, right? So when DSA was kind of getting started in the rank and file strategy, if you spend if 2016 through 2020 was like, holy cow, we might actually elect, this guy Bernie to be president, then you enter the labor movement, you're like, okay, our job, like, I think there's a lot more focus on, even more than before, of like, winning challenges, but to the leadership, but also winning endorsements, right, for your DSA candidates, right? So and that was, I think, because of the time, right? And also there's a lot less focus of the kind of anti-racist aspects that people were really fighting for in the 70s through the 90s, because when DSA was kind of first getting started, the people who were pushing the rank and file strategy were also coming up like, Occupy Black Lives Matter, that didn't really work, right? So now we can see, like, it's, we have to, like, I think what Henry said is true. We have to put this in context of the mass radicalization. When you're talking about labor strategy, right? Like at the bottom of it is like, most of you have jobs. Some of you don't. I hang out with all these, I'm in this anarchist reading group in Minneapolis. So like, sometimes I'm like, well, y'all have jobs, right? And they're like, no. So sometimes you have to pose a question, but what should you be doing in jobs? Right? Like, and what should you be doing when you visit a picket line, right? Like, these are really the basic questions we should really be thinking about all the time, because that's what's going to come up in the day-to-day, right? And when I always think of, like, for me, it's like, what should socialists be doing? You go to the Starbucks, the Starbucks near me had like 2 strikes in the month of August, and they're like, yeah, we just won our election, but the company doesn't want to negotiate for its first contract, so we're going to go on a strike. That's what you're supposed to do, right? And I'm like, yeah. Like, no, that isn't what the labor movement usually does, but it is what we're supposed to be doing. So it's really important to have socialists there to be like, you guys are cool, you guys are doing the right thing, like this is exactly what you should be doing, right? Like what, and then also in the workplace, like to be there both when people radicalize and to radicalize people, right? I work in a food co-op, right? So I will push back a bit on, like, I don't think you can always tell if someone is like a radicalized socialist. That might not always make them a great workplace activist. Like the store manager of one of my stores, Annie did some great socialist alternative examples, but the store manager of one of my stores is I think current socialist alternative member. So and she's a boss, right? So, and not in the like good sense. She's like a boss. So like, right? Like those are most of my coworkers. Like I was doing a one-to-one with a friend with a new coworker. He's a pretty solid dude, and he's like, we're talking. He's like, oh, dude, and he like pulls out this big book, and it's like, with lots of bookmarks, and he's like, Mao says the same thing that you're saying right here, right? So like, that's my example, right? So, and if you're like an adjunct in a university or whatever, right? Like, and then there's going to be other examples where like, yeah, talking about socialism is in the first few months is going to get you punched in the face. On the other hand, there's you know, the last thing I want to end on, sorry for this is being a little bit jumbled, but I just want the last kind of piece of wisdom I wanted to end y'all on is something my friend said, who was in Local 600 for a while, so worked along with General Baker in UAW. He said, look, by the 80s, you know, the guys in the plant knew me. I could be like, you know, when you're like, when you explain socialism to someone in a few words, you're like, you know, whatever. Like, I think workers should run the world, right? Like, that's, most people are gonna be like, oh yeah, that sounds good. But he's like, you know, if I was gonna be like, and we should also not be racist, and we should also not be sexist, like that was a lot harder of a conversation, right? And I think that, so you know, when you're in the workplace, you find that these things are really mixed, right? And so on the day-to-day, where people are at in terms of consciousness, like some people who really want to strike are also kind of like assholes and racist, you know, and some people who are really cool also like don't want to strike, right? So it doesn't, you know, like Annie said, I think it's pretty jumbled. So that's just the last little piece I wanted to end on. But again, like I said, like, you know, right now people are hot in the labor movement right now. So like, if there's anything I can say is like, yeah, get involved in it. It's a really important place to be in. I love talking to my coworkers. So that's what I'll end it on.
Great, thanks a lot, Paul. That's a lot of good historical context. I want to give y'all the opportunity to respond to each other. So take like, you know, up to 5-ish minutes, maybe just in the same order. So Henry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the contributions. I didn't realize you guys interviewed Moody, and I hate to bring him up so much. But I think the biggest thing that I want to emphasize that's different in what I think is important for this conversation today and for DSA is the positionality. Not like, yeah, we should be organizing in our workplace, absolutely. But I think what we want to worry about also is, and the organization or the new forms of organization that Annie was talking about, it's the DSA's labor movement itself and how we engage internally with the different labor working groups and with the national, whatever the new name is, in order to be an organized force. Where if you go to any Starbucks, like I was interviewed Sarah Nelson, and she's like, maybe you saw the video, DSA is everywhere. You know, every picket line I go to, DSA is there. A lot of those interventions, not all of them, are organized by labor working group people. And if you survey any chapter, you're going to have members, some who are involved, many who are not, but who are in different unions, who are staffers, and some who are elected union leaders. And we have this incredible representation and already a strong presence in the labor movement, but it's less than fully conscious of itself. Most of the comrades involved in labor work are not necessarily, haven't done a lot of theoretical study, haven't looked at, and certainly aren't conscious Bolshevik labor activists, which I think is important for MUG. And so really thinking about how do we take the socialist subjective factor that has exploded and is really there. It's not something we have to will into being. It exists now today on almost every picket line. There are DSA members. And how do we take that to the next level, and what role should that be playing? And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely, you know, I totally agree. You know, there's so much we can do in our workplace, but as socialist organizers, rather than in our workplace, but as organizers trying to influence our party, how do we identify the strengths and limitations of our labor work as a party? How do we outline the programmatic discrepancies, where a lot of it's labor cheerleading, which is great, but that's not the same as fighting for a socialist labor movement. And then organizationally, right? If we could, you know, double our numbers, and how do we do that? How do we grow the labor working group into something stronger? It's fantastic that now we have a staffer. What should the staffer be doing? You know, and how do we build labor working groups around the country, and how do we how do we get the people in our chapter, how should a labor working group engage with the wider chapter to, because really everybody should be focused, or almost everybody should be focused on labor. And obviously the majority of, there's a lot of people who aren't focused on labor, don't see it as one of the two most important struggles alongside of elections. And so that's just a different positionality in terms of, and what I think is really important about the Bolshevik method specifically is the focus on specifically socialist organizing within the labor movement as a keystone to leading labor militancy, as a keystone to leading the labor movement as a whole.
Great, thanks, Henry. Annie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh yeah. So I wanted to bring up Starbucks again because I think Paul was saying some kind of interesting stuff about them. I think that this really is a great illustration of this kind of problem of like the relationship between the socialist movement, the labor movement, and the state, in addition to employers, and how these things are all kind of like influencing each other. So Starbucks Workers United is like an example of this kind of like organic form of organization that doesn't really fit what we've seen in the labor movement for a long time, right? Like it started off as this like small group of organizing committees and has kind of snowballed into an organization that has literally like outgrown the bureaucracy behind them, right? Like most of those shops organizing barely have contact with Workers United staff because it's just too big for the union, which in practice has meant that functionally the union functions quasi-independently, the way that like Amazon Labor Union in Staten Island is this like independent organization. Even though it's affiliated to Workers United, it kind of has to function by necessity as its own rank and file run thing, which is an example of when I was talking about new forms of organization, like that's happening there. And it's not really what labor law is designed to fit, right? Like labor law as we know it is very specifically tailored to like, a single concentrated shop that is relatively stable, where a very, very well-equipped bureaucracy with full-time staff and like access to lawyers negotiates a first contract for their shop with the employer. The more you go outside of like that mold, like the kind of like bureaucratized like AFL-CIO model, the more labor law just is not designed to fit what you're doing. So Starbucks is in this situation where like the workers keep like organizing and it keeps spiraling and their organization keeps growing and they keep being blocked from bargaining. And there's this like, as far as I know, unless something's changed in their strategy, still kind of open question of like, are they going to do like a single contract for every shop, which would be incredibly labor intensive, or like regional contracts or like a national master contract. And Starbucks, I guarantee you, is essentially just trying to like stay in the game until the sort of Republican administration that most of us, I think, are anticipating probably happening in the near future, at which point they have a Republican NLRB that can kind of like swat down potential demands for them to just like sit at the table with the workers. So essentially what the campaign is doing, like what it's hinging on, is not just like classic shop floor confrontation, though I do think a lot of the strikes that have been happening in Starbucks stores are pretty incredibly powerful. But it's also this thing where it's creating a political crisis for the state because Starbucks isn't bargaining. And the question is like, can that crisis escalate enough that the NLRB has to be like, okay, shit, like, sorry, Starbucks, you have to bargain a master contract or something. And it's very possible, again, that Starbucks is going to win and that a Republican admin or even the Democratic admin are just kind of going to like sit on their hands or even like actively like block bargaining from happening. At which point I think it's really important for socialists to be there, like with this kind of a political analysis that we have, like in close contact with Starbucks workers, with their organization, sort of like helping them like work through this political experience that they're going to have. I think if this doesn't happen, there's like a non-zero chance that everything's going to kind of demobilize and we're going to lose a lot of these like really cool, really hardworking labor militants that are radicalizing right now through the Starbucks experience. So I think like one of the most important interventions that we can make is literally just to like be in close relationship with these workers, helping them work through what's happening and come to political solutions, like whether they win or not. Like it's great if they win, but it's also great if they like internalize what's happened and come to have like a broader understanding of not just like unions are good and like fuck my boss, but also like we live in a capitalist society with a capitalist state that needs to be overthrown on a political level, and kind of like help them form and hone that analysis. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on the Starbucks question, but I hope that's a helpful example of kind of like what I'm talking about here. A lot of it comes back to kind of the classic advice that like everyone will give you if you're like, oh, what should I do about this strike that's happening? Which is just like walk softly, carry a big stick, like build really strong relationships with the workers and support them as much as possible. And then be in a good position to support them through this political experience that they're going to have.
Thank you, Annie. Your cat seems to agree with you there. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I think just to start off right where Annie ended, like if there's any, you know, if there's a strike around you, like what should you do? You should talk to the workers and well, talk with the workers, right? Not just talk to them. You should, like every time I go to a picket line, it's like, you know, I do like the whole family reunion with all the different socialists who are standing in a clump together. And then I'm like, you know, I got to stop talking to y'all because I want to actually talk to some actual workers here, right? That's what socialists should be doing, right? We should be, you know, like I was on the nurse right now. It was I think the biggest private sector nurses, one of the biggest private sector nurses strikes in history this week in Minnesota, like 18,000 nurses, super political, which, you know, most strikes aren't, but this one really was. People were like, everyone there was like, we are on strike because the healthcare industry is totally messed up and is on the brink of collapse. And one guy, you know, I was talking to one guy, I see him because he has like, he was wearing like a Dream Theater shirt, like the band, with like a nurses union t-shirt like tied on as a cape. And I'm like, all right, you're gonna be a fun guy to talk to. And he says to me, so we started talking and he says to me, he says, look, like, if you see a burning building, you're gonna, you know, and you're standing outside, you're gonna try and save everybody. But the healthcare industry right now is a burning building, but the bosses like it's a preventable fire and the bosses know how to put it out and know how to prevent future fires and they're not doing it. Right. And that's like, I'm like, you know, yes, right. Like that's just like this point that pretty much most of the workers have came to is like, they must be doing this intentionally. And then, you know, then that's when you start being like, okay, well, you know, why is that? Right. So that's like, those types of conversations are really important. Like on DSA, that can be, you know, it can be kind of tough. I think right now, I think it probably varies from city to city. I think like I think there was a moment where like DSA where like everybody was joining DSA, and I think it's more kind of people are, I think, a little bit more spread out now, which it's, you know, gives time for DSA to kind of mature and kind of have like the DSA point of view on labor strategy, which I think is a good thing. So, you know, I think that, you know, it does have to be put into context, right? Like if you like right now, you know, at my workplace, there's a lot of young radical workers, right? Like Starbucks too. People are kind of like out here, and I think in a few other places too, like the CPUSA is kind of big in Starbucks stuff. So like you gotta, you know, there is some negotiating that has to happen. I think the last thing I'll say is like people can also like get consciousness at the same time on two different things, but not make the connections. Like you can be I was at a Starbucks picket line, like all those workers, you know, they're all like, yeah, you know, we're socialists or whatever, and we just want a really good contract, you know, like, so you can be like, you can have like, to actually making those connections as someone who like literally like was like like a person who kind of like ideologically went into the labor movement. Like, I think this is where like, you know, this is where socialists should be. It did actually, going from there to like, I'm gonna like take workplace action with my coworkers, like that is actually a process by itself, right? I'm sure most of y'all here who have kind of done that have done the same. Like you can have the theoretical ideas but to actually go out and do it, you know, it actually, some people start from going out and do it and then get the theory, other people go the reverse way, right? So and I think in DSA that's been an issue, right? Like there have been a lot of people who are like I might look, just to be blunt, I can't go to my DSA labor meeting and talk about issues in UFCW because there are UFCW staffers who are at that meeting, and I don't really want, and especially one of them, those ideas aren't like something I can really talk about with that person, right? So there's kind of different levels of where people are at, right? I think is just that last point.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Rather than go do another round of responses from the panelists, I think it might be good to open up the floor for comments and questions, just so we have a little bit more time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just turn everyone, rather than turn them into a panelist, I'm just going to click allow to talk. And then if you would like to put a comment or a question in, you can either use the Q&A, which I see Jack has already set in, or you could pose the question yourself. Try to keep it to a couple minutes. And to get on Stack, please use the raise hand function. That way it keeps track of who is asking in what order. Jack, would you like to pose the question yourself, or do you want me to read your question out? Just take a couple minutes to do this. Okay, why don't you pose the question yourself while I do this, Jack? I don't know if I've unmuted you yet, but when I get to you, go for it.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah, go ahead.
If folks want to, even if they want to come in and say their question verbally, if you want to type it in the chat, so we can see them, and that way, you know, if there's related questions, we can jump from one to the other. Would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe put your question in the Q&A too, so that we can keep track of all the questions. Okay.
Parker, you mind if I go ahead with the question?
Please go. Yeah.
Great. And thanks, Annie, Paul, Henry, for the very insightful, interesting comments. Lot to chew on. I guess sort of in the vein of sort of concretizing some of these insights or observations that you all have made, I'm wondering, like, you know, in New York City, we have our convention coming up in about a month. And one thing that is a big priority around the chapter is labor. I think like labor is sort of has a renewed interest from folks even outside of like the sort of traditional areas in the chapter that want to do labor work. I think with Starbucks, et cetera, people view labor as really necessary to be engaged in now in particular, although generally as well, it is important. So I expect there to be a large labor campaign in New York City within the next year. And so I'm wondering if, you know, you all have insights on, you know, good sets of principles for a labor-oriented campaign. You know, what would sort of be the strategic and tactical outlook that you would take, and you know, what are some pitfalls, challenges to be aware of when developing a campaign like this? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions and then we'll let everyone respond. So Cliff, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I just dropped it in the chat. But the question is, do openly socialist reform caucuses have potential to politicize the rank and file strategy? And are there any examples of this present or historical?
Okay, thank you, Cliff. And then let's do Robert, and then let's go back and do some answers.
Hey guys, yeah, my question is, what can local chapters do to actually like push forward their local labor movement and not just kind of be one of the kind of socialist support groups that are around there? Our local kind of Amazon organizing unit is they have a lot of outside support, but when it comes to like actually pushing that struggle forward and helping those workers kind of, make stronger demands, it kind of just like falls back on the workers themselves.
Cool. And if you don't mind, Robert, just type that question in the chat too, so the panelists can refer back to it. Let's start from the opposite order. So let's do Paul, Annie, and then Henry.
Yeah, all right. I mean, first starting out with Jack, my good set of principles for a labor-oriented campaign. Workers can liberate themselves, right? Great starting principle. It's we're gonna do it through struggle. We're gonna do it at the bottom up from the shop floor. Those are the I'm old hat on that, right? Like that. I think since we haven't talked about it before, right? Like a big issue, I think, especially in New York City DSA, is an orientation, because it comes up, like I said earlier, with endorsements, is an orientation towards the bureaucracy. Right. Like I think we can say that, in my opinion, so, and we need to really be straight up, like there are some really deep structural issues with the labor bureaucracy, and if we are not focusing and putting our energy on the shop floor, both in the struggles, right, but then also like in like who are we trying to attract? Are we just trying to be like go up to like to one of the organizers or to the exec board and be like, and get them to be socialists? No, we want to create this mass base, and that starts from the shop floor. For the other ones, I mean, I think honestly, for Robert's question, it's pretty similar, right? And I think for TLIF too, like there are lots of openly socialists where when KD was getting started, people aren't stupid, right? Like people aren't like, oh yeah, you guys look like just regular people, definitely not socialists, right? Like I think most people know what they're getting into, right? I think into how to politicize that could, like that. I don't know if openly declaring themselves socialists, it does. I think it'll change some of the dynamic, but I don't know if that by itself is going to be the one to do it.
Thanks, Paul. Annie, you want to go?
Yeah, so one of the first things that come to mind that I think about a lot is like, in terms of Jack's question, is like struggle with people. I think we often get into this really unhelpful like inside outside kind of dichotomy of like, oh, are you like introducing consciousness that already exists, or are you like nurturing the like organic politics that were like hidden beneath the surface, right? And it's like neither of those has ever like discreetly been a real thing ever at any point in history. Like the pendulum has like swung more towards one or the other at different points, and you could point towards all kind of historical examples that are more one or the other. But in practice, like whether you are someone's coworker and you're another rank and file militant, or you're like an outsider, like talking to them at the picket line or something, like you are always like equals that are figuring stuff out together and like both contributing things to the conversation. Like if you're, I guess the example we usually work from is like you're a really developed socialist and the person you're talking to like is either like newly radicalized or not really radicalized, like you're both going to contribute things to the conversation and you're both going to be figuring stuff out together. And you just have to like both listen and treat the person you're talking to with respect, and also be willing to like put your own ideas out there and like push where there needs to be a push. Yeah, it's never like one or the other. It's always like this process that you're engaged in collaboratively. As far as campaigns, it's pretty hard to say like in the abstract. Like I'm making pretty like sweeping and firm statements because I think that produces stronger discussion, but it also is something that you just kind of have to like figure out and process. I think definitely like looking at what is going on with the class right now, like all of these campaigns that are happening where there's like more or less consciousness and like more or less activity and thinking about like where are we best positioned to have a lot of impact, right? Mike Eli, who's a Maoist organizer who worked in the coal fields, who I'm very heavily influenced by, has this great example of how like in the late 60s, early 70s, when the sort of like former student movement was like turning to industry, they all like dispersed really evenly, right? Like a few people went to like every like random factory and mine and like neighborhood struggle and whatever, assuming that you would kind of get what you paid for, right? Like you'd put work in and that would raise organization and consciousness and radicalize people at like roughly the same rate everywhere. That didn't actually happen at all though, right? Like some places blew up and like a ton happened and like a ton of people were radicalized or like did a bunch of like really militant activity or like huge organizations formed. And some places like even at like the height of strike waves, like the conditions just like weren't quite right. And even though there were great organizers putting a ton of work in, nothing actually happened because there's just so much stuff going on economically, communally, that's like outside of our vision that is like shaping what's going to be happening. So I would say really like practice investigation and think about where you're having a campaign, what you're expecting to get out of it, how much work you're willing to put in, what is happening that's outside of your control and what's inside your control to impact it with. Yeah, that's my big advice is like, no one has a good campaign in a box for your chapter, but if you really investigate what's going on around you locally, I bet you can find some shit that is gonna pop off.
Great, thanks, Annie. Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Paul's definitely right that there is always a danger of being too close with the bureaucracy. And I think just having an understanding of where the DSA labor movement is at, which is that it has a pretty strong presence. There's a lot of willingness to support labor. It's not as strong. You know, more people from the chapter could be involved. Normally it's like 10% of people are in labor. And obviously we have like this humongous membership that is paper or inactive. But I think there is a danger of, and like the workers can liberate themselves. I think there is a very healthy instinct towards that. And I think sometimes it becomes a danger because, you know, Marx and Engels talk about that. That didn't mean that they didn't also develop their own socialist theory that many workers didn't share, and that they tried to convince them that, you know, you do that through Marxism. And so I think there is a certain like tail ending or just because people, they see Starbucks workers organizing and they think that's righteous, which it is, and they don't really know themselves and they're very sensitive to sectarianism. They don't want to go and tell Starbucks workers, oh, you're naive. And I'm not saying we should do this, but you're naive to think that, you know, you can just do a vote and then you'll get a contract, or you can just go on a 1 day longer strike, which is what's happening in Boston. We have the longest Starbucks strike. And, you know, I think it's half there, half not, but I've talked to these workers and they're like, yeah, well, every day we're out here, we're hurting their profits, as if Starbucks cares about one store's profits. No, they want to break that strike line. And so I think a lot of comrades are very hesitant to raise criticisms of rank and file workers in struggle. And as Annie said, like, you don't do that by, you don't do that effectively, and you can't do that effectively unless you build credibility with the workers themselves. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens by showing up and supporting them as they ask it. But I think internally, we need to be having more conversations in terms of which way to bend the stick, as Lenin talks about, in order to correct the balance. It's that there's not enough skepticism, criticism of the state of the labor movement, and there's too much cheerleading in some regards. So we should be doing more cheerleading, but we also need to be doing more developing an independent socialist labor movement. I think another huge pitfall is that, unlike a lot of other work, the labor movement is a huge sink that you can just fall into. You can be a good socialist and then suddenly you're, I'm caught up organizing Uber drivers and there's so much to do. I could do no socialism ever again. And I could spend every day working hard to organize the working class. And that would be good from a trade union point of view, but bad from a socialist point of view. And so I think we have a unique danger that our best comrades get pulled away into union work. And that can have a really dangerous impact on the socialist labor movement because we need to have strong interior structures that are theoretically developed, that are building. So I think we always need to be developing capacity through political education, through active recruitment. We take best practices, Jane McAlevey, one-on-ones and whatever, and apply it to our own internal work of you need to call people before a meeting. You need to have one-on-ones. You need to do active recruitment. You need to do, keep meticulous lists of your own, labor branch. And so I think there's a big pitfall that we get too absorbed in the tangible work and not enough in building our own capacity. And if we really believe that the socialist movement is the key to a successful labor movement, which I think is the orthodox Bolshevik perspective, then we have to prioritize our own development. Well, we never want to be aloof from the workers' movement. We always want to be embedded in it. I think that there are, in terms of the rank and file strategy, there's this very interesting piece by Trotsky where he talks about this slogan of rank and file and how it's really a confused slogan that leaders are by definition not rank and file, and we want to be leaders of the labor movement. And so I think that's interesting. There's absolutely socialist groups that have engaged or formed united fronts with different sort of reform movements. And I do think, I think what's most important is having a national socialist group that's organizing people in the labor movement to a theoretical level, gathering all this already existing socialists and organizing them and building from that out. But I'll drop that link by Trotsky just because I think it's an interesting read on the subject. And I think, there's probably comrades who are already playing a leading role in your local labor movement. I think Working Mass has been a really helpful and concrete tool that workers really appreciate, getting to tell their own story and getting it shared around the country. So I would love to see a national DSA labor blog. I think it's silly to have a regional one. We should just have one national one. And but also other groups, it's not that hard to run a blog, but it does take a serious commitment, and it's easy to not be active with the blog. But I think that that's one way that solves both the problems, because you can also develop an independent socialist analysis in there. But yeah, it takes time.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll have a few more questions, and I just want to encourage participants, observers, you're welcome to make comments or questions. And, we still have almost an hour left, 50 minutes. So feel free to, make a comment that's longer than the usual kind of Q&A session in a DSA or socialist event. We want to give people more than just a couple of minutes to make kind of in-depth comments if you want to. So let's have Matthew, and then we'll have Lucas, and then Manny.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for such a compelling discussion on socialist work in the labor movement. My question was, and I posted it in the chat, so since we're talking about a partyist approach to labor strategy, and it's been a long time since there's anything approaching a Marxist party worth the name in the United States, how do the panelists see their outlook for work within the labor movement in relation to the historical debates on the approach to trade unions in the communist movement in the United States? I'm thinking particularly about the different approaches the Communist Party USA took to the question. Should the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission seek to play a role similar to the Trade Union Educational League? That's it.
Great. Lucas, you're up next.
Oh, we're asking the questions in sequence?
Yep. Yeah. A couple at a time.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess my question was sort of, I guess, thinking critically about, how we got to the adoption of the rank and file strategy and like what the actual intervention of a partyist approach looks like. So like, I guess, to put it in terms of a question, why was the rank and file strategy adopted? Like presumably we don't think that it was just like a Trotskyist plot to deviate from the moral science of Marxism, Leninism, and that there were like reasons why it appealed to socialists in the American labor movement. What were those reasons? And what problems arise in that rank and file strategy that a party approach to labor actually solves, in terms of just like, pitching that to folks in the DSA who might not have like a pre-existing fealty to the Bolshevik tradition, but are interested in winning.
Great. Thank you, Lucas. Let's have Manny.
Hi, comrades. Thank you for having me. So earlier this year, I was actually appointed to union alternate steward position with the postal workers. And I say appointed because I didn't ask for it, and I was just kind of told you're going to be the union steward. And yeah, it is a mixed bag because I really like my coworkers, and I've been involved in leading some work for actions, some grievance campaigns, and I had quite a reputation. And I wasn't expecting them to do this because I had no contact with the union officials who decided to adopt me. But I went into the marriage blind, which is really not a good idea. But it also stemmed from the fact that when you're on a work floor and you are put a reference, you're defending a lot of people's jobs just in your relationships. So if forget the grievance procedure, forget defense versus discipline, even your ability to relate to management, to show that you can intimidate them, but can also help them out. That you can keep them from getting into trouble, or you could get them into trouble, which doesn't really sound like a militant union lean, but when you're dealing with these supervisors, there's a degree of deception. And I'm not talking about pretending to be their friend. That gets very dangerous. You don't want any worker thinking that you're friends with the supervisor. But your ability to have one over them, your ability to have them in a vice grip, and then to say, okay, you can get off, I'm going to make your life hell, is a key function of being a labor organizer on the floor. And so in that chaos where a lot of people's jobs, could depend on you if they're in the probationary period, if you're helping them get out of something, being a postal worker, you have the Hatch Act, which is really for patronage or for politics historically. But if you're a socialist, you want to succeed. So you want to imagine the most ultimate scenario of what you're going to have to face. And the lack of political direction has basically made this into more of a training opportunity than a platform for me in any real sense. But that's not a bad thing either. I'm not complaining, but I want to be clear that it's been a training opportunity too, in a very marginal presence of a fairly militant and strong labor union, at least in my local and in my branch. But I was also a socialist at the time, and the leadership that I was getting from my group at the time was pretty much agnostic. But my takeaway today is, besides the ranks themselves or the officials, if you have a presence in a work floor, it's basically going to be one of three things. It's going to be a friend group, it's going to be a study group, or a campaigning group. There's really nothing else you can be at that level, unless you have what I was going to raise, the trade union education link, because you need a reference point that's greater than any three of those things. There's nothing wrong with being a friend group and supporting workers supporting workers, but the relationships that I've found, because relationships really, that word is the key word, they tended to be based on casualization. Oh, we're working so hard, let's go drink or whatever, or workplace roles. And as I've gained seniority, everyone finds a niche on the floor. And my niche is partly in the union office. I don't have a regular section that I'm always in. So that's really undermined me. Frankly, you know, there's a lot of people who care about me, I care about them, but I speak to them less because I don't even spend that much time in the union office, but just because of the way the culture works. So I'm actually planning to, now that I'm no longer poor and I don't need this job, get a more flexible schedule so I can do more politics. And I'm looking at being a UPS part-timer. So it's mainly just been a learning lesson. But the key thing is when you're on the work floor, you're really gonna either have a friend group, a campaigning group, or a study group. I've had all three, but they're all going to be very ephemeral, especially if you don't have the benefit that I have of being in a workplace with hundreds of workers. If you only have 24, it's going to be very ephemeral. And you need a reference point. I don't think a group like MUG or any other group that doesn't have, you know, 4 digits can be that reference point on a national level. So I think it's a useful point of agitation that there should just be DSA labor. There should be socialist labor. Just call yourself socialist labor. Or democratic socialist labor if you really need to, but the workers don't know what DSA is, but they know what the word socialist is. Also briefly on transitory organizations, yeah, it's like a transitory organization to make the socialist into a trade unionist. But if you have a transitory organization to make the union into socialist, you're going back to what Trotsky said about how you need to do 2 things programmatically: change the politics of the unions, but also the form. In every single union area aspect, there's a need to actually change the form of the union in some way programmatically that you can figure it out. And a lot of the workers and a lot of the union officials who are complaining about things being obviously inefficient, it's not just that the union doesn't have the right program, it's also that the union itself is by no means a finished product. And if you can wrap your head around that and explain it to people, that will really enhance you. So I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Manny, and the other questioners. So let's have the panelists respond to that. Why don't we start with Annie this time? So a couple different questions on the Trade Union Education League and how did DSA adopt the rank and file strategy, and what do we do with members who aren't necessarily committed Bolsheviks?
Yeah, okay, these are great questions. I'm gonna start with Matt and this kind of like historical question. So I think it's worth kind of like going through the narrative of like what became of the TUEL and like the formations after it before answering this in brief. For folks that don't know, the TUEL is the Trade Union Educational League, which is kind of the first, sorry about the 1,000 Discord messages I'm getting, the first sort of like formation within the labor movement set up by the American Communist Party. And it essentially was this kind of educational service / caucus within the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, that agitated around like kind of like demands that still came up and would come up later, like industrial unionism and union democracy, but also kind of defense of the Soviet Union, which was very like young at the time and like politicizing people around it. I think that I tend to be very harsh on kind of like an approach that is kind of like, oh, we should do like the TUEL again, or like, oh, we should do the IWW again, like these kinds of like models that people want to replicate because they were formed in response to really specific conditions, right? Like the TUEL was trying to transform the American Federation of Labor, which is this like reactionary, racist, sexist, class-based labor federation. Eventually, they kind of like got sick of that and felt like the AFL bureaucracy was so entrenched and it was such an uphill battle. And in conjunction with stuff that was going on internationally, with the turn to what we would call like the third period, where communists started like breaking from official union federations and forming alternative federations, Communist Party decided to break from them and form what they called the Trade Union Unity League. which was its own labor federation founded on communist principles. It was an industrial union. It was integrated. It made a lot of semi-successful, not always successful efforts to involve women. It was significantly more democratic than the AFL. And it also, by and large, failed. Like they spent years trying to build it. It was pretty successful in light industry in a few cities, especially in New York. It failed to get entrenched in heavy manufacturing or in mining, though they made a lot of effort to. And then eventually when communists who were working within the AFL, specifically the Communist Party members in the Longshore Union on the West Coast, like Harry Bridges, Trotskyists in the Teamsters in Minneapolis, and then auto workers in, I think it's Toledo, I should know that for a fact, in the mid-30s. Paul is giving me a thumbs up, thank you. Were able to lead successful strikes within AFL unions. Then there's sort of like a turn towards like, okay, maybe we should get involved back in the AFL because clearly there's like a level of militancy happening and it is possible to do work within the AFL. And at the same time, like again, like international conditions were shifting. They were moving towards the Popular Front, where the Communist Party wanted to work in coalition against fascism with the liberals and like re-enter the unions. So people were like, okay, fuck it, we're rejoining the AFL. After rejoining the AFL though, the CIO was formed, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was pushing for industrial unionism and integration and a higher level of militancy. And the communists got very involved in that. And it went from being, again, what you might think of as kind of a reform caucus of a sort, to being like, actually, we can't work within the AFL anymore. So we're going to split. And then the CIO split. And then it was one of the most successful organizing waves in American history, probably the most successful. So the point that I'm trying to make here, again, is not, oh, actually, we should do the CIO, or oh, actually, we should do the TUUL, or oh, actually, we should do the TUEL, but that all of these things happened in relation to what was actually going on organically. Like it wasn't just like from first principles, we do boring from within to transform reactionary unions, or from first principles, we refuse to work with reactionary unions and do dual unionism. They were responding to what was going on and what they felt were the needs of the moment. And if they hadn't done that, a lot of the more successful organizing later couldn't have happened, right? Like the TUUL ultimately failed, but it did give a bunch of communist militants a ton of educational experience in running industrial unions, which allowed them to build up the CIO. Like that probably would not have happened nearly as effectively if there wasn't this huge base of people who already were like, oh yeah, I know how to build one of these things. I had one more other thing that I was going to say about this. Yeah, so I think like where we need to start from now is, you know, we can study these examples and we can be like, what's useful from these, what's similar about these conditions, what's different. But ultimately we need to start figuring out our own thing and considering the conditions that we're in, right? Like right now we have a very, very entrenched AFL-CIO that is like decaying, that doesn't seem to me at least like it's on the verge of collapse. We have a labor movement that is very young and is starting to spill outside to some degree from the AFL-CIO with stuff like Amazon Labor Union and like to a limited degree Starbucks Workers United. We have to start figuring out like, okay, how are we actually going to relate to these things? Not on the basis of like, this is the correct strategy that was passed down, but like what actually makes sense for our conditions. A last thing that I'll say about this question is that one thing that is correct about people's sort of critiques of what we'd call like dual unionism, right? Like this like splitting methodology is like, people always frame it as like, you have to stay close to the workers to be able to organize them and politicize them. And if you're splitting into other unions, you're not able to do that. You're separating yourself off from the majority of workers. That principle is totally correct. The problem is that tactically that means totally different things in different circumstances, right? Like the CIO was a dual union. Like it was splitting from the AFL and like claiming the same territory as the AFL. But in that case, it was a dual union that was doing that because that was what allowed them to organize the vast majority of workers and be in close contact with the vast majority of workers when the AFL was actually despite being like the official union federation, were the ones who are closing themselves off. And while I don't necessarily think that we're at a point where we need to start actively pushing for like a split or the end of the AFL-CIO, I do think that we need to be sort of wary of the degree to which the AFL-CIO is closing itself off from a lot of the working class, and we don't want to get closed off with them. And so whatever organizing methods we choose and whatever structure we choose, we need to think about that. I do think that where this sort of historical example is correct, and Manny spoke to this quite a bit in his question, was that we do need to start thinking about what kind of like national form of organization makes most sense for our activity in the labor movement. I think like the baseline to start from this is the DSLC, the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission. But I do think that we need to start having conversations about what the DSLC should actually look like and what it should be doing on a broader level, because a lot of what I see is just this kind of like sleepwalking, like, yeah, we should organize logistics. Like, we got to do a Starbucks solidarity campaign. And there's not a lot of thinking about like strategy or what its purpose is, other than that it's good for us to have a labor commission. So if there's a use to these kind of historical examples, it's that I do think we need a national level labor formation. But what kind of form that needs to take is going to be very dependent on our analysis of what's actually going on in the workers' movement right now. And I will end there.
Thanks, Annie. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. I think that I wanted to kind of address, I think, I can't see, but like Matthew's question, I think Lucas's question, in a little bit my own way. I just want to, I think when we talk, for me, like the most valuable thing socialist organization has given me, and I've been in a few, right? For the labor, for my, activity within the labor movement has been mentorship. And that for me was joining Tempest, right? Like I got to be with the old heads, like that's been, and that's been like really, really helpful for me to have people who have been in the struggle for a while to like call and talk to for advice and stuff, right? And that I think at its heart is really like the most valuable thing a socialist organization has to offer on the day-to-day, right? Because like what Manny was saying, like, yeah, that's the labor movement. They're like, if you have a pulse, like you're going to be a steward, So, and if you don't want to just get caught like doing, labor movement stuff, like Henry was talking about earlier, like, guess what? There are people who have had that same problem before, and like it's really helpful to talk to them about it. And there are people who are having the same problem right now. Excuse me, who are having the same problem right now in a place across the country, right? Like, whether I met a couple of UFCW people through DSA, like, there's a bunch, there's a lot of DSA people who are involved in UAWD, which is awesome, right? They're UAW, they're Teamsters in DSA, right? Like it goes on like that. So I think building those connections are really important. So that, I think the last thing, I think just to go off what Annie said about like, this stuff comes up through history. I didn't get a chance to say it before, so I'll say it now. Like, I think in terms of just to answer for Lucas, like, and one thing that we got to be, like right now, what are really big struggles on the street, and how do we bring those into the labor movement for people who are not, I guess, like ideological Bolsheviks or whatever. Like, I think from right now, like talk about abortion, right? Like, how do we get that? How do we build a mass movement for abortion rights? Like socialist intervention is key, but like also we gotta, it's been really important that Planned Parenthood is organizing, right? And exposing like the issues in the nonprofit structure and then the healthcare industry. Like I remember, right? I think it was one of the Planned Parenthoods when the workers were organizing. They said something. It was right around the Dobbs decision. They put out a memo saying like, we're not going to voluntarily recognize the union because choice is our most important value. Like, like how messed up do you have to be to say that? Like how fucked up is that to say? That's where like, you'd be like, okay, well, like there are rank and file workers who are rebelling against that. let's politicize that struggle, right? So thinking about it that way, I think is really important. Like, how do we take what's happening on the streets and bring it in to the workplace, right? And why is that important? Right. That's the second part. So thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Henry, if you want to say something.
Thanks. Yeah, just so to Lucas's question about people who aren't Leninists and why was the rank and file strategy adopted? I mean, I think just even if Moody's document never existed, like, we should remember that there was socialists before Marx, and that Marx made a lot of innovations, but regarding socialism, it was that socialism will be won through the workers, that and it was actually Engels who really developed this theory, but that socialism needs to be a working class movement. And so I think we have people who, like, they want free healthcare, and they're socialists, or they were socialists, but they weren't necessarily focused on the labor movement. They thought unions were good, but they didn't have the Marxist perspective that the working class through struggle is key. And I think maybe it's a little hard to think back and even remember and realize that. But because I think so many comrades now do have that perspective, and it's sort of common sense. So I think that either that what the rank and file, adopting the rank and file strategy represents is a move towards recognizing the working class as the revolutionary agent of change, the labor movement as the one of the two key fields alongside elections, that housing, environmental, etc., are just not on the same level in terms of the power that they can bring to bear on the capitalist class. And that would have happened with or without Moody. And with or without Moody, in my opinion, Moody turns this theory, this wrong theory of socialist consciousness, into a conscious theory, or semi-conscious theory, and spreads it. Although, again, I don't think most people accept that when they read the document, or they're not suddenly convinced Moodyists. I think that issue would have happened with or without the document being how we approach this, which is just that people have everybody begins with a low understanding of socialism or no understanding of socialism, and they move towards a high understanding of socialism. And one of the crucial theoretical questions is the development of consciousness. And so people need to have discussions about how consciousness develops, and how the conscious, the people in this room who are aware of these issues, should engage with those who aren't in order to convince them that it's important to get them. So that's almost like a second level, like a hyper consciousness of the conscious consciously organizing, which is a theme throughout Marxism. I mean, I agree with what Annie says about we need to be context dependent, and there's not we never want to be formulaic as Marxists. I mean, I would go further and say that I do think if we look at the context, the tool is the TUEL is generally a step in the right direction in terms of having a national labor publication. And this is, again, like Kim's terrible, Moody's terrible, like, misrepresentation of the TULE. That's like, I mean, you read the Labor Herald, their publication, and it's like, Lenin was a great innovator, and the Russian Revolution was right for suppressing free speech. And Moody's like, oh yeah, this is like a baseline transitional organization that was just fighting for, like, amalgamation, right? Which is obviously, those are two totally different things, right? And so I do think that having a national publication that's engaging with the left wing of the labor movement is crucial. I think the Communist Party had a different membership standard. And so because DSA is not a application-based cadre organization with stricter membership requirements, I think there can be the role that the party labor publication can be in its relationship to the members, you know, there's no reason why everybody who doesn't agree with the labor blog can't become a member. They don't need to, you know, pass some sort of rigorous test to join. So I think, you know, that can be rethought. But what we're definitely not in a period of, in my opinion, is the need to break definitely from the AFL-CIO. I think that's a question that is still in the form of a question. We do have these great independent or semi-independent union drives that have their limitations, but that's where the exciting organizing, a lot of it is. But absolutely, the AFL-CIO is not, it's not shut us off like they did with the communists. You know, they were trying to do the inside strategy and they were all fucking purged. So it's hard to keep that strategy up when you're getting purged. And also this third period in Stalinist, you know, Stalin doing his thing, complicated things. But so I think, you know, it's not the order of the day to launch a whole new labor federation, although maybe that will come up. That's not my perspective, but and it is the order of the day to continue working within the AFL-CIO, while also supporting any independent unions as they organize. And so I think that the TULE does provide a general formula that is mostly correct. And I think the tactics of are tactics that we're largely already doing, and we should double down on and professionalize and do more consciously, which is we have, you know, we don't have a national labor publication, but we have, you know, Jacobin exists, Working Mass exists, Cosmonaut exists. So there is like a labor, and this is something that can be strengthened, a socialist labor publication that's worker facing, that's labor militant facing, that's more than like labor notes, that is definitely socialist, in word, not just in you know, the people who are running it. And also that we have this organizations that allow for both comrades and, which is what the tool had, right? Anybody could join the tool. There was communists in this, there was communist adjacent non-members in it. And I think we do have entities like that where not everybody is a DSA member. I know in Boston Labor Working Group, we occasionally have we have industry groups, like educators, and not everybody is a member. I don't think there's any reason why they shouldn't be recruited, or why they shouldn't be recruited. Yeah. But I think just this sort of broader engagement with the left-wing labor militants. And I do think one thing that I would differentiate from the TULE approach is a stronger focus on finding, because they already exist, identifying, locating people who are already socialists in the labor movement. There's a million of them at least, and recruiting them directly to the organization, to the DSA, and building this socialist national formation, which we have, but strengthening it, making it more conscious of its task, making it have a higher profile. And I do think, I mean, I think a comment said that workers don't know what DSA is. I think a lot of workers do know what DSA is, and especially the ones that are really the most important, the ones who are at the vanguard. Doesn't mean everyone does, but so I would just go a bit further and say, yeah, we should look at context, but considering the context, like, we should have an opinion about which stage has the most to say and which are inappropriate. And I think the tools is a fantastic model, but does have some things that need to be altered. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. So we have about 20 minutes left, so make sure to put your hand up if you have a question or comment, because we got time for maybe one or two more rounds. So we have a question from Eric. So what is the relationship between the rank and file strategy and internationalism broadly? And then Alex would like to speak.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thank you all for coming here today. I have a couple comments. I'll try to formulate a question at the end. One thing I'll say is, I would just reiterate what Henry was touching on, namely that, I do think rank and file strategy points to and reinforces the idea that the working class is in fact the agent of change to get rid of capitalism, to see socialism one day. And one thing that I think we should be a little weary of is I think we should be weary of calling for experimentation due to the fact that the goal for Marxists is to develop the political consciousness of the working class. And the way to do that is, I mean, in my opinion, to actually strengthen, our political coordination in the labor movement. Now, I don't know exactly what would be the best tactical way to do that. I probably think that building something like the TUEL would make sense. But I also think that currently working within the AFL-CIO is most likely going to pay off simply because of its size relatively. With regards to legality, illegality, do you get purged? Do you not get purged? Well, I mean, even if they tried to purge it, so what? So what? The Bolsheviks went into the Tsar's organized Ukraina and organized the working class there to fight for political freedom, to agitate for socialism within the Tsar's controlled, secret police controlled trade union Ukraina. So that's an example that I think of often. And this again reiterates the point, spontaneous versus political consciousness. How do socialists develop the political consciousness of the working class, right? As someone who spent many years organizing economically, there is constantly the threat that all the economic organizing, all the consciousness raising that we do at work, talking to people, small conversations here and there, walking out, getting petitions signed, going on strike if you're lucky, that it all ends up in nothing. Because if you do not organize the working class politically, if you do not raise the political consciousness of the working class, if you don't have a mass organization, a mass party to organize people into, with a clear program and a clear direction in which to actually take political power and to have a political competition with the bourgeoisie on a national level, it's very easy for things to fizzle out. And I mean, I think most of us know people who have dropped out. So, a question I think that I could raise is, if we had those kind of strong internal political structures that Henry got at, what do comrades think would be the best way to practically coordinate the political efforts of DSA members in order to organize the working class that we need?
Great, thank you, Alex. Seeing no one else on Stack, do the panelists want to respond to Alex's prompt and also Eric's question on the broad relationship between the rank and file strategy and internationalism? Or maybe we can kind of expand that to, if you're a critic of the rank and file strategy, of whatever labor strategy you propose and internationalism. Annie, do you want to start again?
No, I did not, but I can probably.
Okay, well, we can get someone else, maybe Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, like, I just want to do one little short work story. Like, I always think this is so cool. I think my I work next to the bakers, and two of the bakers. One is like a punk trans guy from Nebraska, and the other is like kind of an older dude originally from the Tigray region of Ethiopia, where there's been a war, right? So both like really big immigrant populations in the Twin Cities, like you know, queer punks from red states and people from East Africa, like really big. And so, and of course they start to talk to each other. And now, like even more than this dude is my friend C, he's like the trans guy from Nebraska. He will not stop talking about this war, the war in Tigray. Man, that war in Tigray is some crazy stuff. Like, man, that you know, the prime minister of Ethiopia, he's a bad guy. And you know, I mean, you know, maybe people have different opinions of the war in Ethiopia. But the issue, I think like when that happens to the workplace, that is really cool to see, right? And I think that's a really great role for socialists, right? Like bringing in people from other struggles is a really like classic thing. Like, oh, you know, y'all should like, you know, this group of people should come to like in the 70s and the 80s, a really big thing people would do is like, Dave Ranney talks about it in one of his books, but like, oh, there's the Iranian students are having a big protest against the Shah. Well, you know, get the striking workers to go make a delegation over there, or get the Iranian students protesting against the Shah to like come over to the strike, right? Like that's a really great role for socialists. The other thing is like the role of solidarity work. I think what CISFES did in the 80s was really great, and a lot of that was involved like the huge trade union movements that were being built in El Salvador at the time. I think the stuff that was going on with that has and is going on with the Mexican labor movement. Like I think it was really great to see Cynthia, the independent union in GM in Mexico, come up to labor notes this year, right? So that kind of thing of like making those connections at a really basic level. That's kind of like, you know, bread and butter easy stuff to do. Like, you know, y'all probably know, you know, the good thing about socialism is we're like nerds about international stuff. So like we know something that's going on that probably isn't being talked about in the news. So, you know, that's a really, you know, that's a great way to start talking to your coworkers, right? Like, hey, you hear about what's going on in this country or whatever, or you hear about what these grocery store workers in Ireland did in the 80s to stop to fight back against apartheid. We should do the same thing here, right? I think, you know, just for Alex's question, I think like in the trade union movement, like broad, you know, I think in the socialist movement, there's some great old tips and tricks that we can just keep with and maybe not need to experiment. In the labor movement, we, you know, like if we didn't need to experiment, like labor movement would be in a lot better place, right? Like we need to try some new stuff in the labor movement, and socialists have been the forefront of that. So I don't know if that's, you know, but yeah, I think on the other part of like, you know, we shouldn't be afraid, and we need to be talking about politics. Yeah, you know, 100% agree with that, right? Like that is super, super critical. We gotta, you know, it is really easy to be like, all right, well, like I'm gonna like, you know, just talk about union stuff, and then next year I'm gonna talk about the politics. No, like you gotta be doing it from the beginning, right? And you know, finally, that's the last other really great thing socialists are good at, is being like, you know, like, well, these people were in a worse situation. We talk about the Ukraine, like these people are in a worse situation than you in another country in a worse out system, and they did it. Why can't we? Like socialists love to do that, and right, like, and we can do that too, right? That's a great thing to be like, hey, you know, that's a great pep speech, right? Like pep talk, like, you know, like, well, like, look, those South African had apartheid, and they still built a kick-ass labor movement. Like the workers in Marikana were getting shot down by the police 10 years ago, and they still built a union out of it, right? Like socialists are so good at making at doing that kind of pep talk. So I think that's a great little thing to do. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. So we do have one more question. I wonder if Grace, would you like to ask your question really quick before we have the other two panelists respond, and then we can give Paul an extra chance to respond to it afterwards too.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I get for taking too long to gather my thoughts. Also, just thank you so much for having me as an observer from SA. I'm having a very nice Saturday morning listening to this discussion. It's been really good. I guess really quickly, I just wanted to ask, like, okay, I think that there's been a really good discussion in talking about like how, in general terms, like the Starbucks work is going, and the relationship between that. I really agree with Annie's characterization of like generally about what the situation is between rank and file, unionizing Starbucks workers and bureaucracy, but also like I feel like we have to look squarely at we're looking at like a decrease in momentum, right? Like this in the Ewing review, there was Buffalo and this explosion of like ambition and excitement. And people having this like, yeah, union's good, fuck my boss consciousness and acting on it, you know what I mean? Which is this huge, step forward. But also like now getting like a really harsh education in just how good corporations are at using the vast resources at their disposal, like CIA agents, like Pinkerton spies, to terrorize them and crush their efforts. Like, and I mean, the fact that it took 6 months to reinstate the Memphis 7, right? And in the meantime, Starbucks is like, this is a great strategy. Let's fire a bunch more people. And, I mean, I'm just imagining the number of people like, having their hours cut or just being like fucked with in the workplace or throwing in the towel at this point. And I feel like, in talking about, there's a lot of figuring out to do and how we skillfully navigate this, right? And this like excited new workforce with SBWU, like, and I don't know. I think I don't have any like hard conclusions about this, but I mean, we're talking about horrible union busting from corporations, and how are we going to fight back against these corporations in a combative way? And I mean, I feel like that's socialist bread and butter. Like this is where we can really spring into action around this. And I think if people kind of have any thoughts about like the current state of that, I mean, with Starbucks, but also Amazon, right? Like huge deals, but clearly it's not a foregone conclusion on how that can be replicated elsewhere, right? Like there are discussions and debates happening. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm bad at wrapping up. Anyway, thanks.
Great. So yeah, I know that's a lot to finish in 8 minutes. So, take a couple minutes, maybe we'll go 3-4 minutes over, since I think we started like 3 minutes late. I know that's a lot of questions and things to answer with wrapping up and all, but do your best. Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I mean, just to Grace's last comment, I mean, I just think it's totally normal. I think people sort of, especially newly radicalized people, like people were so excited, they really thought Bernie was going to win, and then suddenly they like become ultra leftists because they see that like he lost. Like just having patience and realizing that like movements are always happening in waves. Sometimes the waves are going up, other times the waves are going down. We're fortunate to be in the first. And the role of an organization, the role of a party, is to be there at the highs and be there at the lows. And there's different strategy and tactics in different periods. When workers are striking, maybe it's not the time to raise your lessons, your socialist lessons that we've been talking about. But then after things slow down, or there's a defeat, that is the right time. But just to have confidence that it's totally normal. If no movement ever had slowdowns, then we would have overthrown capitalism already. So when we have just in the same way that like it's totally normal that a socialist movement starts with middle class people and goes towards workers, like when we recognize that as a natural process that has happened many times in history, then we can not freak out as much and have a stronger understanding of the development and what role we should play at different stages and what we should expect. So I think that's crucial. In terms of the comment who asked the question about, how can we engage with the DSLC? Like, I think this conference is a tremendous step forward. This isn't a conversation that I think it's going to take place more and more. I think it is happening, but it's, most people are focused on the sexy, exciting workers' strikes and not on the internal strategy beyond just like, oh, we should take union jobs. And so I think that, if the 42 people on this call or 40 people on this call, like all agreed that the DSLC should do something, and we, have a good reputation in our local chapters, our local labor working groups, like we could easily get a petition of several hundred people. And that's like way more, we would be way more organized than the DSLC itself. So I think the caucus has an incredibly important role to play that is irreplaceable in DSA at this time. And labor has not had a lot of caucus debate and activity, really. Like there haven't really been like different lines that have been developed in the recent period as much as I think would be healthy. It's healthy to have debate. It's healthy. And in my perspective, like what we're laying out here, like Bolshevism is a higher level of consciousness than non-Bolshevik socialist movement. And that doesn't happen naturally. That's not the natural state. You have to will it into being by organizing. And so you have to have a caucus or at least people who agree on that. And so I'm really excited by this conference. And I hope that the platform, I mean, I think the interest in labor isn't reflected, and maybe this can be brought up in the later debates. Like reading the website, like it doesn't speak to me basically at all as a laborer, as a worker, or as a labor organizer. And so I think that is we really are Leninists and recognize, or even Marxists and recognize that labor is one of the most important fields of struggle, if not the most important field. There should be, points of unity or other things that reflect that. And there was one more question that I'm forgetting.
I think on internationalism, maybe.
Oh yeah. I mean, I love the theory of combined and uneven development. And I think that what internationalism allows us to bring, as Paul was saying, is perspectives when groups have achieved a higher level of struggle than where we are. It's almost like looking into the future, because there are answers to the questions that we have now and questions that haven't begun to be asked. And we can take those lessons and educate people and bring that consciousness in. And absolutely, the Russian Revolution, being the highest stage of worker revolution ever and the most thorough, is an important one. And so I think that's one way to answer the question. Yeah, I mean, there's more you could say about like international solidarity that I think Paul touched on. That's correct. But I think recognizing that that the Russian Revolution was at the theoretical stage because it was really, in some ways, an outgrowth of the German workers' movement, and was heavily influenced and inspired by it, and didn't start off anew as the Neuronnics did, where they're trying to develop a whole new theory. No, they brought in German ideas and Marx's ideas and Kautsky, and they were able to apply those in Russia and not have to develop them anew themselves through hard lessons and theoretical writing books and stuff. And so that internationalism allows us to bring ideas to the working class that can help speed up the process if they're brought in skillfully. So I think just in general, like my concluding thoughts, there is a tremendous need for bringing this awareness of the important role of consciousness and of the politicization of the labor movement to DSA. Really work. Some are coming to it theoretically, but in other people's daily work, they're coming to it practically. They're saying, we've been doing this labor working group I've been in it for 2 years, and we're not stronger than we were 2 years ago. And our members keep getting pulled away. And, I'm a socialist, but I find myself, just advocating for unions. And I don't think that unions are, they're good, but they're not enough. And so I think people are ready to hear this. The people that matter, the active members who are active in the labor working groups and active in the labor work, a lot of them are ready, and some of them don't see that. But what is needed is a conscious movement to bring the Bolshevik theory of socialism and the labor movement to these people openly. And that if we can do that, if the 40 people on this call can get organized and do that as part of MUG, then it'll meet with tremendous success. And there's like few organized obstacles to, besides just the large, like underdeveloped consciousness, there's people who want to professionalize our labor work. They want to see a change. And if we can tie in, not just bring them consciousness, but bring them the practical results of that consciousness, the strategy, things like, hey, we should have a national labor blog. That's going to be really exciting. Sign on and participate, and I think this caucus can play a tremendous leadership role in pushing DSA labor in the right direction, which is crucial for the DSA. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thanks a lot, Henry, and thanks for the criticism too. It's I would respond, but we're out of time. So I'm just going to have Annie put some final thoughts and wrap ups, and then I'm going to let Paul do like a 1 minute response to Grace's question. Sorry for running late, everyone.
I'll try to be concise since we're out of time. Yeah, I mean, as kind of like a final anecdote that I want to bring up, that Mike Eli, whose interview we dropped further up in the chat, talked about. So when the Maoists were like entering the coal fields in the 1970s, and they were kind of trying to do educational work, right? Like there were already these kind of like mass strikes going on, and they could provide some like organizing and support, but really like the movement was moving forward without them, and there wasn't that much they could do. So they're kind of focused on doing this educational work. And rather than this kind of like, you know, like they had a political perspective and a program they're united around, but it wasn't just a purely didactic kind of like talking about their program, and nor was it this kind of like organic kind of like, oh, like what lessons can we draw from what happened with the supervisor the other day? You know, oh, there's a safety hazard. What can we learn from this about capitalism? But they were actually like posing kind of like political problems in conversation with their coworkers, and they would say stuff like, hey, like there's a militant, like Black-led labor movement in the auto plants in Detroit right now. Like if they like launched an insurrection and took over the city, like would we send them coal? Like what would you guys do? Like they were really trying to pose these kind of like revolutionary political questions as like practical problems to be solved together between them and their coworkers. And in the process kind of like tried to develop militants who were really thinking about these problems actively and thinking, you know, they didn't just have Marxist political ideas, but were thinking like Marxists and had a critical analysis like Marxists. So I really think a lot of what we're doing is that kind of development. And as Paul said, like there literally isn't a blueprint that we could use from like the Bolsheviks didn't really, even though there are political lessons we can learn from them, they didn't leave an instruction manual that can be applied to our context exactly. So it is going to take a lot of kind of throwing ourselves at the movement and learning these things. And it's a process. Like we're developing as a socialist movement in the same way that the workers movement is developing in unison with us. You know, it's kind of a played out example, but like the only reason they knew how to set up Soviets in 1917 is because they'd done the same thing in 1905, even though 1905 was like a big failure. But, you know, it helped the class develop and learn how to do stuff literally. And I think that that also speaks to kind of what Grace was saying about Starbucks workers. Like every single labor organizer on this call or former labor organizer has been fired for organizing, or they've lost a union drive, or they've lost a contract vote, or like whatever. And that can be one of the most valuable learning experiences that you and your coworkers can have if you kind of take the lessons to heart and synthesize it and talk about it, and don't just like get discouraged and let your coworkers get discouraged and drift away. You really have to like think about like, okay, where do we take this defeat? Which is kind of what I was speaking about to Starbucks before, like whether or not they get their contract and their union remains stable, like we need to be in the room working through these kind of like practical problems and talking through them collaboratively. Yeah, I think that I will end it there.
Thank you so much, Annie. And Paul, just last thoughts to wrap up.
Yeah, I just wanted to wrap up. But first, you know, my little joke. If you pardon the old-fashioned language, I'd like to send from Tempest fraternal greetings to all of y'all, but identical greetings to one of y'all. Anyway, so I think what I just wanted to say, like in the as for like what to do in the next few months, like if you're, you know, I do think the labor movement is cool and sexy right now, and we should really be involved in it, right? Like that's going to be where I am. Being in DS, but of course it's going to vary from workplace to workplace, right? So that's a great thing about, if you're in the labor struggle, sometimes it's kind of boring at your workplace, and then it's a great time to go focus in DSA, right? But when they go and get taught, there's different places to be in. The last thing I wanted to just say is me and other comrades are trying to start up like a class struggle unionism labor movement. So class struggle unionist labor network. I think it should be, it's gonna, I think it's kind of around what Henry is talking about, but hopefully, I think if you're involved in that, you can just send me an email. I'll put that in the chat right now, but otherwise, good luck in the conference, and I'll be quiet.
All right, thank you so much to all our panelists, and special thanks to Paul for joining kind of last minute. I had some stuff going on in my family life, so I appreciate, some things were last minute for me, so I appreciate everyone's ability to work with us here. I think that was a great panel, good first one. Thanks to all the observers for showing up. Our next panel will be on Lenin's political strategy at 1 p.m. Eastern in approximately 54 minutes. This one's going to be really cool. It's a kind of a different generational cohort. We have some old timers. We have August Nimps, who's the author of Lenin's electoral strategy, The Ballots, the Streets, or Both, which is part of our cadre curriculum. We have Gil Schaefer, who's a member of SDS and the Bay Area Revolutionary Union, and he's written for Cosmonaut and New Paul magazine and stuff like that. And lastly, we have Jack Conrad from the Communist Party of Great Britain. So yeah, that's at 1 o'clock. That's going to be great. I'm just going to post the schedule for the rest of the Congress real quick in the chat so people can see it. I will also post our perspectives document, which is the only document that's not on the website that we're going to be debating at one of the sections here. Just give me a second to find the doc. Here it is. Copy. How do I copy? Control C, Command C. There we go. Okay. So yeah, thanks everyone for showing up. All the links that the various panelists and attendees have dropped in the chat, there were a lot of them, and Edward has helpfully compiled them, and I think we're gonna release them in our next bulletin, so be on the lookout for that. So they won't be lost to history. Oh yeah, do the panelists want to put their Twitters in the Twitter bios in the thing? Henry mentioned. Here's Paul's. I'll send it out. Oh, Paul. So for some reason, only Paul can chat to attendees, but Henry and Annie can't. Here's Annie's. Henry, do you want to share yours? But anyway, yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. I think this has been very successful. And I think some of the organizers are going to stay on for just to talk technical things, but yeah, panel's over now.
You can probably end the recording here.
All right, I forgot.